Hello and welcome to the Airline Weekly Lounge. I'm your host, Gordon Smith, and this week I'm joined by Ashab Rizvi from the Skift Research team to talk all things low-cost, long-haul. Hi Ashab, how's it going?
It's awesome. I've just finished writing the sub post for the second part of my report, so it's going great. And I've also been told that today is my first anniversary with Skift, which is super awesome, being part of such an amazing organization. So yeah, all good.
Double congratulations in store. So your first anniversary and part two of your report. For those that aren't familiar, Ashab has just completed quite a beefy report for the Skift Research team looking into the low-cost long-haul airline sector. And Ashab, for maybe the 1% of our listeners who aren't quite familiar with what that means, for their benefit, in your own words, what does low-cost long-haul mean?
Sure. So this is one of the final frontiers of commercial aviation, and this is basically low-cost budget airlines venturing into long-haul operations per se. So, and this has been a very widely talked about topic. We have seen many airline casualties in this space as well. So there's always this conversation: what strategy or what exactly are we? Is there a one size fits all strategy that can work for low cost budget airlines to finally venture into long haul?
You're absolutely right. It is one of the hottest topics around at the moment, but it has been really a super hot topic for decades, going back to Freddie Laker and the Sky Train crossing the Atlantic for budget fares, and even going back to Loftledir, which I think was an Icelandic airline back in the '60s. I think Bill and Hillary Clinton, if I'm correct, they did some of their hippie trips to Europe back in the day, going via Iceland on what was one of the pioneers of low cost travel. Just for our listeners' benefit, Ashab, it's important to define between a low cost model on short haul or medium haul networks, like we see with Southwest and Ryanair, maybe 2, 3, 4 hours, and long haul. What are the challenges that start to creep into the business model when you start to stretch the sector length to 7, 8+ hours?
Sure. I think yeah, that's a fair question, and I think that is what most of the airlines have been trying to uh, get an answer for. So there's a bunch of reasons why, uh, and why some of these airlines have been unsuccessful, especially entering into long haul space. And to list down a couple of reasons why this idea and why this hasn't worked until this point, I'll give you a couple of reasons. One of them is typically LCCs rely on a single class cabin on most of their flights, taking Ryanair, EasyJet, or even Southwest, for example. And for long haul flights, single class cabins aren't very optimal. So this has been something that airlines have not been able. I mean, for airlines, for LCCs to go out of their way, out of their business model to include a multiple class cabin, or even try wide body aircrafts is something that is very difficult for them to do and go completely out of their way to do that. So that's one of the challenges why this hasn't worked. uh, then we also see in my report, I've also mentioned that the finance cost or the rental cost per flight actually goes up as LCCs try a, a longer stage length flight. So in one of my analysis, what I also found was that the finance cost actually increases by 8% as US airlines moved away from domestic to international markets. So again, that is also another component that becomes worrisome for the airline. These budget-friendly airlines have always relied on their cost effectiveness, their their model, which is heavily reliant on making sure that they have very less cost to handle, and for their costs to go up is again something that becomes very difficult for them to handle. Along with the higher finance cost, our analysis also found out that on transatlantic routes, versus compared to domestic routes for US airlines, the percentage of aircraft fuel expenses also goes up by 5%, by 5 basis points. So on domestic network, the cost contribution of aircraft fuel is roughly about 21%, and it goes up to 26% when they go on international routes, specifically on transatlantic routes. So again, that's another component. And fuel, as we all know, is a highly volatile expense for the airline. No matter what they do, there is very little control that they have over fuel. And there are a couple of other reasons which are very, very specific to budget airlines as well. And one of them is using regional airports. So legacy airlines, they typically operate from hubs from JFK or from Boston Logan, but airlines like EasyJet or Ryanair, they would ideally look for a secondary or a regional airport to operate most of their flights, and that is not very optimal for for stimulating business demand, and it's largely focused on intercontinental or domestic networks. So for long haul flights, you would probably need some business demand as well, so that you can have higher class cabins and higher prices as well. And that again becomes a big challenge, especially when you're operating out of these smaller regional airports. And then finally, I guess their reputation for service quality is not that great. Anybody traveling for 8 to 9 hours of journey, it's very difficult to convince them to sit in a seat with no IFE, a very small seat with domestic like seat width, and that becomes another challenge. People don't want to travel on long and ultra long haul journey on those seats, so their reputation for service quality also impacts and has historically impacted why they have always felt that instead of venturing into a long haul, it's probably better for us to stay committed to short and medium haul networks. And those were some of the reasons why there's this challenge with uh, operating and successfully operating and profitably operating a long haul network.
Really, really interesting. Lots of themes to unpack there, Ashab. One of them that struck me, having read the report, is the focus on ancillary revenues. So these are the add-ons
Yeah,
that can be incredibly profitable on a short-haul network. So if you're flying from London to Paris, to use a generic example, five, six, eight sectors a day, depending on how short the sector might be, you have got eight opportunities to get 180 people to buy your sandwiches, to buy your luggage, to buy your allocated seats. If you're then just using that equivalent aircraft for one sector or two sectors a day, you've got far less opportunity to sell your wares. Is that a consideration as well?
absolutely. We've actually talked about that on the other part of the report, where we say that if your frequency of flight is lesser because now you're operating a 7 8 hour flight, so you're basically operating two flights or two legs in a single day, your opportunity goes down considerably versus operating between six different cities on a domestic network. So and then one of the expectations on a long haul flight also is to have is I mean, especially if people have been traveling on legacy network airlines for a while now. So there is that expectation that they will be offered meals on different intervals, and there will be other benefits and services. Now that is also a big miss, because if airline starts charging for every little thing, there is that resentment within passengers that they've been doing so on other airlines and it was fairly good, and now they have to pay for all of this, each and every little service, because they basically unbundle all the services and just charge you for a basic seat price. So the lesser opportunities for ancillary, like you just pointed out, and also having to pay for literally everything on an 8 hour flight becomes very difficult for airlines to manage.
You mentioned 8 hours there. I think I mentioned 8 hour figure as well, Ashab. I remember flying AirAsia X from London Stansted to Kuala Lumpur on an Airbus
Yeah.
A340 in 2009, and I was able to get the fare one way direct Stansted Kuala Lumpur for £99 back then, which even adjusted for inflation is an incredible fare.
Yes.
And yeah, it is incredible, completely unsustainable. The route didn't last very long, especially with a fuel thirsty A340 in the mix. But what struck me on the the origin and departure side of things, London's obviously a huge draw, as is Kuala Lumpur to a lesser extent for backpackers and for holiday makers, not to mention VFR. How reliant are airlines, traditional airlines, on feeder traffic for supplying getting the bums on seats for these flights. If you don't have the established network, if you're coming in cold as a new entrant, long haul, low cost carrier, you're not going to have the network feed. Is that an issue as well?
Absolutely, it's one of the issues that we've also pointed out in our report, that they lack the network effects. So if you choose to operate a point-to-point model rather than the complex hub and spoke, which traditionally is operated by legacy carriers, I mean it's a very effective system for a long-haul flight, and you will end up losing. I mean, it's very difficult for you to get that feeder traffic uh, if you've only started along. I mean, and it's probably going to take you a while to get a strong point-to-point network demand, OD demand, and 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 that can vary very well. But then legacy airlines have this strong network advantage, which is very difficult for legacy LCCs to compete with.
Really, really interesting stuff. And I know in the report you referenced some data from Skift Research exploring Gen Z and millennial travel habits. There are a lot of young people who are short for cash, but also want to have these lifestyle experiences. Surely there's enough of these people to simplify things that are happy to put up with a lousy seat, no or little IFE, a non-existent meal, or maybe a very basic meal. If you're getting a really cheap fare, are there not enough people on these trunk routes to support low cost long haul? Why is it so hard?
I mean, actually, there is. So I think this is where we get into the second part of the report, which what we're saying here is that despite these challenges, this this new emerging middle class and this changing travel preferences, especially within young people, that may be one of the drivers for this potential demands that LCCs might see before they venture into long haul. So even if, I mean, one of our research survey actually says that a very tiny population, uh, and I'll give you the numbers. We found that only 30%, 31% of millennials in the US and Gen Z were open to flying more than 6 hours, and just under 22% in the UK, and in Germany, this percentage was even lower at 20. But even if that's the case, we're still looking at 44 million passengers just in America, and about 6 million odd passengers in the UK and in Germany, people of that age who want to travel, which is still a very big market for LCCs to capture. So now we are moving from, okay, there have been historical challenges with this business model, but post pandemic and with this new generation and their changing travel preferences, is there a real opportunity? Looks like there is a real opportunity. And this is where it is. This demographic is going to be the first one that LCCs can potentially target, because they don't want a three-course meal on an 8-hour flight. They might be fine because they have their own smartphones. Maybe they don't want the super high tech or the basic ones at British Airways, the IFE at British Airways. But so they might as well be fine as long as the airline is giving them a super cheap deal on a long haul flight.
So much more to discuss, Ashab. Stay with us. We will take a very short break. In part two, we'll continue our low cost long haul discussion. Don't go anywhere. Hello and welcome back to the Airline Weekly Lounge podcast. I'm your host, Gordon Smith, and this week I'm joined by Ashab Rizvi from Skift's research team, and we are discussing all things low cost long haul. Ashab has just published a report, a two-part report, in fact, picking through some of the themes, the opportunities, the trends. Part one, we looked at some of the challenges, Ashab. Let's maybe try and put a little bit more of a positive spin on it, if we can, in part two. There's new aircraft which were not around 10, 15, 20 years ago. I'm thinking the Dreamliner, I'm looking at the A350, potentially even the 777X, but also the single aisle A321 XLR, maybe even the MAX 10. There are new aircraft types coming on board, which could potentially make the low cost long haul model a little more feasible. Should we be excited about those?
I think perhaps that's arguably the biggest and the most important change that is going to lead from the front uh, for the low cost airline business model and this new generation of aircrafts. We've and I've talked about the A321s in particular and the Boeing 737 Maxes. These can be game changers for especially for unlocking the successful long haul because they offer very high efficiency on their aircraft. They offer amazing range. Now LCCs can target leisure passengers, which is their traditional market, and they can now fly all the way directly to some of the beautiful leisure destinations across the world, which was previously not possible because they could not go outside of their business model and taking in wide bodies. So that is going to be a very big, massive change that is going to lead this evolution.
And if we look at the transatlantic as a flashpoint for low cost long haul, currently, if you want to use a loose definition of low cost, we've got JetBlue in there with the 321 LRs. We've got North Atlantic Airways flying the 787s. Talk us through the comparable business models at play there.
Sure. So JetBlue only started their transatlantic service in 2021, and they have been using the A321 NEOs. So they stuck with their business model of only flying narrow bodies, which doesn't have the complexity of flying wide body aircrafts. But we have seen a new breed of airlines like French Bee and like North Atlantic, which have specifically used only wide bodies to fly between destinations, and especially on essentially offering uh, cheaper tickets on these long haul, low cost flights. Now, one of the advantages that JetBlue has, especially using the A321 NEOs, is that its total operating cost per flight is roughly one third of a Boeing 777. So that gives you a massive advantage, especially in terms of cost. And this cost advantage, when allows the airline to offer even lower fares. So that's their typical strategy. When we look at the strategy that was adopted by airlines like French Bee and North Atlantic, their strategy, while it is very comparable to JetBlue's because North Atlantic also offers a premium cabin, and it also offers they're heavily reliant on making sure that they fill up the aircraft. In the last few years, their load factors have been around 90%, but they haven't been very profitable. I mean, one of my analysis also shows that prior to North Atlantic, we used to have Norwegian, which was also trying to do the same thing using the 787 Dreamliners. They were only profitable in 3 of the 7 years before the pandemic. Now, the challenge versus now, if I look at JetBlue's financials, they have been very profitable in transatlantic operations. We were able to get information from U.S. Department of Defense, U.S. Department of Transport. My apologies, and they airlines are expected to publish financial performances by region. So JetBlue on transatlantic routes had an operating profit margin of nearly 51% in the third quarter of 2023, which is one of the most important quarters for US aviation, US airlines. But North Atlantic, although it's doing fairly well, but hasn't done as incredibly well financially as JetBlue. So that's where there is that difference. It becomes very difficult to manage a wide body because the total operating expenses is very high. While I understand that Norse was able to get amazing lease agreements in the first place, but it's not going to be very easy for other airlines operating wide bodies.
Yeah, some unique factors influencing Norse's current setup. And you're absolutely right, Ashab. I was on the first flight from Oslo to JFK a couple of years ago and spoke to Bjorn, the airline CEO. And yeah, they got a very, very, very good deal on
Yep.
their
Yep.
Dreamliners secured during the pandemic. And a question that he's often asked in more recent months and even the past year or so is, if you're struggling to make money with these dirt cheap 787s that you got on a basically a fire sale basis during the peak of the pandemic, if you're struggling to make the business model work on those terms with such a relatively efficient
Exactly.
aircraft on very, very competitive finance terms. What hope has anyone else got, never mind themselves, to make low cost long haul across the Atlantic work, never mind further afield? Let's just take a look at some of the other themes that are developing. You mentioned the rising middle class in many parts of the world, Ashab. People are wanting to travel more. And we've seen that with low cost carriers within given countries on a domestic basis. People are looking to travel further afield. Were there any particular parts of the world, aside from the transatlantic region, that are sort of hot areas to watch?
Absolutely. I mean, Asia Pacific, for instance, is a very big market where we see there's this growing middle class with this unsatiable desire to travel. And we have seen, not just from our surveys, but because I'm based out of this part of the world, the difference in spending habits, the difference in focus, the difference in this desire to travel, what I'm seeing in my generation and what we have seen in generations before, there's a stark difference here. Indigo, which happens to be one of the biggest low cost airlines in this part of the world, has actually started flights. Uh, they're not technically long haul flights, but it has direct flights into Baku, Azerbaijan. It is also has many flights going to Central Asia to Tashkent. Now, these are leisure-specific destinations, and uh, given the fact that Indian government was able to secure visa-free entries, both the countries were able to agree on visa-free entries of travelers back and forth. Indigo was the first airline in this part of the world to pounce on that opportunity and announce direct daily flights to these countries. And you will not believe most of these flights going to these parts of the world going on 90% load factors, and these are these flights to these countries are actually doing so well that Indigo is now thinking that they're potentially looking to start more long haul operations, and there is an active conversation about getting wide bodies so that they can actually travel even further into Europe and into Central Asia. So the besides the transatlantic market, Mexico, Southeast Asia, some of the some of the most success one of the most successful long haul low cost airlines, AirAsia X, is actually based in this part of the world. And then you've got Scoot, which is Singapore Airlines' LCC. Again, it has flights all the way from Singapore to Athens. And then there is Indigo, and there are many other airlines here which are doing incredibly well. Fly Dubai, for instance, is another one which is based out of Dubai, sister LCC of Emirates. This part of the world, huge population, almost one third of the global population is actually based out of this part of the world, and airlines are the first one to bank on this opportunity.
Plenty of opportunity. I think we'd all agree. Just keen to get your closing thoughts, Ashab. You mentioned load factors, and no airline CEO is going to turn their nose up at a 90%, 95% load factor, especially in the lower season. Let's talk about yield, though, because it's one thing getting those bums on the seats, to put it bluntly, but if they're not paying the way, then the entire business model falls apart. A busy plane is only half the battle. You need to be getting that pricing right.
Sure. And yeah, I mean, my second report that was launched just yesterday, I think one of the focus points was, despite having the cost advantage that LCCs have, unless for them to be successful on long haul networks, they will definitely need to add a premium cabin, and that is going to have a massive impact on the yields for the airline, because otherwise just covering operating expenses might not be enough, because the kind of information that we have looked at and the data that we have looked at, we have largely covered operating expenses, but we all know that there are non-operating expenses as well that airlines have to cover. So absolutely, they have to make sure that they have these premium cabins in place, and they're able to extract and get the fair prices correct, because otherwise uh, it is only going to take them so long to not just become profitable, and maybe they'll just wind up their operations, because domestically it makes a lot of sense for them, but internationally and on long haul, yield is going to play a very big factor. One final thought that I would still want to make, Gordon,
Sure, go ahead.
if we have just a few more minutes to squeeze this in, which is uh, air, airport slots are very important. We talked about having slots at primary airports. I mean, operating out of secondary hubs might not be enough for you to stimulate enough demand. So one of the examples that we looked at was JetBlue's transatlantic flights. And one of the reasons why they were able to do so well, because they're actually operating between LHR and JFK, between Boston Local to Paris CDG, between Amsterdam Schiphol to JFK, and they've also recently announced flights to Edinburgh and Dublin. So one of the key strategies is operating out of primary hubs and making sure that they have. So it's not just on the aircraft side of things, not just so just the demand part of that, and making sure that you're able to stimulate the right demand from the right place is also very very important. So what JetBlue was able to do is incredible. They've recently decided to slash many unprofitable routes, but as we all know, none of the transatlantic routes were impacted. In fact, they have decided to increase frequencies on their transatlantic flight, which only goes to show how much profit they're making on those flights. And then having premium cabin, having a decent loyalty program. We saw Ryanair's CEO making a point about Southwest, saying that it's no longer a true LCC. It's no longer a true budget airline. And to some extent, it's also true. And we can also say the same thing about JetBlue as well. So, this evolving nature of the low cost business model is also very essential for any of the airline executive to make sure that the long haul prospect works. And the JetBlue was very smart. They only had about 2% of their capacity on the long haul network. So, that prudent cautious planning is very important. If you just go full on into long haul, it might be very risky. But just having established medium short haul network and then slowly and gradually planning your long haul network might be more prudent. So those would be my final thoughts. Yes.
Awesome final insights, Ashab. Thank you again for sharing those with us and our global audience. If you want to learn more about Ashab's research, the challenges with low cost long haul, and the opportunities with low cost long haul, visit research.skift.com. Much more information there. And Ashab will also be sharing an extract from his report in the next issue of Airline Weekly. As we're recording Wednesday, that will be dropping on Monday morning. So keep an eye out for that for any subscribers among you. My thanks again to Ashab for joining us. Appreciate it's getting late where you are in India, so really appreciate your insights and sticking around to share those with us. Wherever you are in the world, thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time on the Airline Weekly Lounge. Bye for now.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of the Airline Weekly Lounge podcast. Check out airlineweekly.com for a new issue every Monday and updates on the latest airline news throughout the week.